Welcome to the ITSP Magazine Podcast Network. You are about to listen to an episode of the Audio Signals podcast with Marco Ciappelli. In this new season, Audio Signals is repositioning its antennas, focusing not just on the stories, but on the storytellers. In our modern hybrid analog-digital society, the art of storytelling has never been more vital or displayed such a diverse array of forms. Recognizing this, our conversations will spotlight the narrators, providing a unique exploration into the minds behind the narratives. From authors to podcasters, visual artists to songwriters, and everything in between, we will engage with all who contribute to this extraordinary tapestry of human experience. We are all made of stories, after all.
All right, everybody, this is Marco Ciappelli. Welcome to another episode of Audio Signals on ITSP Magazine. As you know, lately I have repositioned the antenna to talk a little bit more about stories and storytellers. Today, it's not really a story in terms of an adventure, although in a way it is. It's our human adventures, if I may define it so. And is of course based on reality. It's something that we are facing every day here in America, but also in other parts of the world. And I look at this as the relationship between different people that live, especially in a democracy and in our society. An analysis, from what I understand, of the situation of racism and how politics are somehow instrumentalizing the story. And maybe, again, we go back in the story, you can tell the same story from different perspective and is received and, again, instrumentalized for politics sometimes unfortunately, in a different way. I am not the one qualified to talk about this. So we actually have a professor, Juliet Hooker from Brown University, professor of political science. That she wrote a book called Black Grief, White Grievance, The Politics of Loss. And we are going to talk about that. So for the people already looking at the video, you see she's here with me. For the people listening, here she is. Juliet, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
I'm very happy to be here, and I have many questions. I'm sure the audience will have many questions, so I'll try to guess what they will want to know. But let's start with who you are, your background, and what made you decide to write this book. I know you wrote other before, but this one in particular, so to get the conversation started.
Of course. So I'm currently the Royce Family Professor of Teaching Excellence in Political Science. Sorry, that's a mouthful, at Brown University. And my work over the course of my career has been really focused on, I'm a political theorist. And so I've been thinking a lot about racial justice, about how we might, have about democratic theory, and I draw a lot of my work from African-American political thought. And so this current book is a book about political loss. It's about the way in which various responses to loss, the ways in which people have mobilized around real and perceived loss in U.S. democracy, and how that affects the strength and resilience of democratic institutions. And so the title of the book is Black Grief, White Grievance, The Politics of Loss. And it basically argues that Black grief and white grievance are two of the things that are really driving contemporary, mobilizations around race in the U.S. right now. And two examples of those, for example, are the movement for Black Lives and all of the racial justice protests of 2020 that were really mobilized by police killings of Black people. And then on the one hand, the other hand, of course, things like the January 2021 insurrection at the Capitol that were driven in part by this sense of a loss that had happened, and that was a primarily white set of folks who felt like they had been, that even though the election was legitimate, that they had been cheated out of their candidate winning. And so the book is trying to think about how we respond to loss and how that becomes a force in politics.
Right. And so the first thought to me, especially because I often talk about society and technology, it goes immediately into social media, echo chambers, and amplifying this conversation for one gain and another loss. And again, spinning this cube to show one facet of it according to what your main interest is. But from what I understand in the book, you also go back before social media and highlight the fact that these kind of conversations have been already instrumentalized and also helped in the past the civil rights movement as well. So can we start from maybe the beginning, chronologically speaking, and then we can see what's going on now?
Absolutely. So in the book, I go back to earlier moments in U.S. history in the 19th and early 20th century when we saw these mobilizations around loss, particularly Black activism, and they were often followed by these moments of white resistance. And so, both mobilization driven by Black grief and white grievance are not new. I talk about different moments in the book. One of those moments is there's a chapter in the book that looks at the work of Harriet Jacobs and Ida B. Wells. And Jacobs is writing, of course, she was an enslaved woman, and she writes this narrative in which she talks about the horrors of slavery and the ways in which she tried to resist. So she's writing about the pre-Civil War, in the pre-Civil War era. And then Wells is writing at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, during the height of lynching and, these white race massacres that are happening throughout the country. And what's really fascinating, I think, in thinking about, the use of technology is that Wells is one of the first people to start using photographs of lynchings to try to impel people to oppose these horrible spectacles, where the lynching photographs are a really interesting artifact because they're not taken as evidence that the lynching happened. They're taken as souvenirs. And so people are taking these photographs and smiling and taking them as a memento of these horrible moments of violence and racial terror. And she turns that on its head and instead starts using them to prove to audiences that when she's telling them these massacres are happening, that it's true. So that's an interesting moment, right, where this new technology, the photograph, starts to be used in these struggles over how to tell the story of racial violence, how to get an audience to believe you. And then, we see some of the same kind of debates happening that, you see later now with the videos of police violence, or the ways in which people, misinformation, and the ways in which people talk about, what might have happened, or how, whether to believe the evidence that, an atrocity happened, that we see in these discussions on social media.
Right. And I understand you focus on the condition in the United States, the democracy, how it gets affected here. But I was reading your background. You have studies, and I believe you come from Latin America. So I'm from Europe. I like to think about the differences in the way that certain culture affect a certain topic. And do you feel like this is a very unique and belonging to the United States democracy type of conversation, or it can be spin into a more wider sociological angle in other part of the world?
Yeah, this is a really good question. So I think in, the book itself is certainly focused and draws most of its examples and its analysis from the history of the United States, particularly 19th and 20th century. But I think the questions that I raise about political loss and how people respond to it, I think are applicable beyond the United States. So, so for example, one of the things that I talk about in the book is this idea of grieving activism, right? How people who have lost loved ones in particular become activists in the wake of their death to try to get justice for their loved ones who suffered some kind of injustice. And this is something that we see all over the world, right? If you look at Latin America, where I am from, one of the iconic examples of particularly mothers doing this kind of grieving activism is the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, whose, peaceful protest became so central, in actually, making the case for the brutality of the dictatorship in Argentina that they were opposing. And so I think these kinds of, these ways in which the book tries to think through how people mobilize around loss go beyond the examples of racial politics in the US that I focused on in the book.
And is there some recurring technique, some kind of, like I like to talk about propaganda that has always existed, except that now we have different technology. I go back to that. Mm-hmm. And we can amplify, we can use different media, compare with dropping flyers on a war zone in the enemy line. Now we are doing it on social media. And mm-hmm. I don't want to compare this with an enemy. I don't like personally to go into us and them conversation, but it certainly drives towards that us and them, like, okay, this is what happened. How do I instrumentalize this? How do I not? So I guess to go back, do you see, analyzing the past and the present, some recurring technique, some, maybe, I don't want to say mistake, but maybe some way that the conversation could be amplify better, even when you do the grieving or the grieving maybe part, because I don't want to help the grievance for that, for sure.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think, there are a number of strategies that I think we see recurring over time when people are trying to do this kind of activism to make the losses or the injustices that they have suffered visible. One of them is enumeration, quantification, right? So if you think about, when people put out these benchmarks of like 100,000 people have died or 1 million people have died, let's say from the coronavirus pandemic most recently, or how many people have died in war. These are ways of trying to bring home, right, the cost of a conflict. And often the critique of that is that it doesn't give us a sense of who the victims were as people, right? That they become just these numbers. And so the other strategy that I think we see throughout is the attempt to humanize the victims, right? To say, to tell the stories of individual people, that they were members of families, that they leave people behind who care about them, to tell their stories. So that people will care about them. Now, the danger there is that, I saw a recent, critique of the ways in which the case of a journalist who was a dual American citizen, how that was responded to. And it's like, suddenly it became, what was important was that she was an American citizen and therefore you should care, as opposed to she had been killed and we should care even if she wasn't an American citizen, right? So I think those are some of the dominant strategies, and each has risks, right? Or has dangers that come with it. But I think beyond that, the other issue is this question of why we we attend or we care more about the losses of some people than others, and why some people have to prove their humanity before we'll care about their suffering. And so that there's always a cost for people who have to convince us that we need to care about the losses that they're suffering.
Which is usually the point where I shake my head, because shouldn't be like this, right? Can you define, maybe in a little bit more detail for people that haven't read the book yet, this difference between the grief and the grievance? So the literally the meaning and how we apply that in our social psychology per se.
Yeah, of course. So, so grief and grievance have the same etymological origin, but when we talk about them, I think when we think about grief, we're thinking about sadness, right? The feelings that come from a loss. Grievance refers instead to the sense that you have suffered a harm or injury, and then the complaint that people make based on having suffered this harm or injury, right? So in the book, I talk about the move from grief to grievance, right? That you can suffer a loss. Sometimes it's if someone dies of natural causes, of course there's grief, but there isn't a move to grievance because, it wasn't caused by someone else. But in the case of a loss that is the result, let's say, of state inaction, right? There was supposed to be some kind of, regulation that could have prevented a fire, and someone dies in it. Then often, there's the move to grievance to try to say, oh, how do we change the situation so this doesn't happen to anyone else, or so the parties that were responsible are held responsible. So this is what I mean by grief and grievance.
And in there, it comes the concept of privilege, right? So one thing is to lose life and be considered at a different level as a human from others, versus, well, I'm sad because I don't have that privilege anymore. I don't know why we need to explain this, but we probably have to. So let's go there.
Right. So, one of the things that I'm doing in the book is saying Black grief and white grievance are two ways in which people are mobilizing in response to loss in the United States. But I want to be clear, and I'm glad you brought this up, that I'm not saying they're equivalent, right? So the losses that African Americans are often having to mobilize in response to are of life itself, right? People who were killed, for example, by police violence, or people who were lynched, or the losses associated with segregation when the country was segregated or not being able to vote. Whereas white grievance is often motivated not so much by material losses, right? Even though there's a lot of talk about economic anxiety motivating, racial resentment in the United States among white working class people. But when you look, for example, at things like the January 2021 insurrection, a lot of those people were CEOs, they were doctors, they were lawyers, they weren't suffering economic losses. So they were motivated by other sense of being displaced, right? So often it's this fear that the country's changing, that they're not at the center of political debates anymore, or their interests aren't the ones that are predominating. And so there's a sense of displacement, or a fear often, actually. It's not even that they have been displaced, but the fear that they will be displaced in the future that then motivates, I think, people who have been used to being the dominant group then to mobilize to try to defend what they see as their rightful position.
So I think you talk about accepting the fact that, and here we can go in some as a political science professor, explaining democracy if is needed, where it's not 100%. We're not in the polis of the classic Greek town. We are a 51. So there is always going to be somebody that win and somebody that lose. And I think you make a point in your book where, first of all, we probably in America, we don't know how to deal with that. We don't know how to accept it, maybe more than in other places, maybe. And is this a lack of culture? Is this a lack of education? I mean, what did you find out here, and maybe what can we do to kind of have this conversation? I mean, it's a social contract in the end. So.
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the things that I emphasize in the book is that we often think about democracy in terms of empowerment, right? So you go out, you organize, you get people together, and you get your candidate to win, or you get your policy to be adopted, and it all feels good. But in fact, right, if you won, that means someone else lost. Right. So democracy is as much about losing as it is about winning, but we don't talk about that other side of it. And this is, I think, what we see is that when you have I think in the United States, you have a democracy that has been shaped by white supremacy. And this has meant that some groups, the dominant group, whites as a group, have had to suffer fewer losses and so they're less accustomed to having to accept even legitimate loss. I think, your point probably about the US, because of its position as a world power and, being a superpower or, one of the dominant economies in the world, I think you're right that in general, probably the US has been as a country less accustomed to loss than, let's say, I'm from Nicaragua, which is a little country that was repeatedly invaded or fought over by major powers throughout its history. Like you just, you know that you are kind of at the mercy of these larger geopolitical forces. That's not an experience that most US citizens have.
No, it makes sense. But what surprised me a little bit too is how this conversation has been going, I think, for quite a while, with ups and downs in the news. And unfortunately, lately, they're not, they're kind of hammering on the same bell. And do you see some progress happening? And maybe even looking at the upcoming election soon. I mean, the whole political environment, I feel like it's much more extreme. I remember when I was studying back in the 90s, political government, the US was still looked at as a bipartisan, solid, with very few differences, while now we're actually looking at kind of like going to the extreme. And I feel like the people that suffer the most in this are, again, the minority and the immigrants and the black movement. That, again, why instrumentalize so much by the other? So I know it's a big question, but
yeah,
if you can give me some of your opinion, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I think we are in a moment that is. So I would say two things in response to that. One of them is that the first is that we're in a moment of deep backlash, where I think in 2020, you saw these enormous multiracial but Black-led protests, and this moment when people were really trying to think about what racial justice would require and what we needed to do. And I think and this was coming on the heels of a very energized Black protest movement. And I think what we're seeing now is a very sustained and deep backlash to that, a sense that we need to, that was a moment of gains that need to be reversed and are being reversed. If you look at things that, the Supreme Court decisions on affirmative action, the attack on voting rights. I mean, there's a clear sense of that that people are trying to undermine whatever gains were made in the past couple of decades, trying to move forward in terms of greater racial equality. And I think that, that has been the pattern throughout U.S. history. And I think the moment in which we find ourselves is also one that I think tells us something about U.S. democracy, right? That in the past, when we thought U.S. democracy was healthy, and when we thought, everything is fine, we were probably not looking at some of the ways in which minorities in particular were still having a really hard time participating politically. And so from the perspective of maybe the dominant parties, I think, or was there a smooth handover of power, things of that sort. It seemed like it was healthy, but when you looked more deeply, there were always these issues that had never been resolved and continued to undermine U.S. democracy. And I think now, unfortunately, one of the major parties has become a very right-wing, radicalized party, and we find ourselves in a moment when a lot of them are unwilling to accept that the wins of their opponent might be legitimate, and so they're willing to dispense with democracy for the sake of not having to share power.
And that's probably the most dangerous thing that could happen for politics. And I think you're right. I mean, history has always been written by the powerful. So I think that's why we are rewriting history lately. And it's not for the sake of rewriting. It's just because to be honest into what really happened and not what have been told us by those that were printing the book. Let's go back to that, right? So talking about the storytelling, I mean, I have to touch before we end this conversation in the role of media and the news in all of this. Yeah, but that's the question. But how much is the media influencing the wrong narrative and what maybe can be and should be done to have an honest view on things?
Yeah, no, I think there's been a lot of critiques of the media for good reason, because I think there is a sense in which the sort of defaults of journalism don't serve us well in this moment, right? The sort of idea that to tell an accurate story, you have to tell both sides. Well, what happens if actually there is, asymmetry, right? So one side is more radical than the other, but you're forcing it into this, we have two extremes. And that actually, going back to the way this played out, in the 1960s, people would talk about the NAACP and the KKK like they were two extremes. So again, the sense that we have a hard time talking about radicalization, I think, when it doesn't fit into this both sides narrative, and similarly with the way in which people talk about polarization, right? So this sense that the problem is that we're not getting along, or the problem is that we're not, working together, as opposed to the problem is that we have, let's say, injustice, and people are calling that out. And facing backlash for it. So I think I think there is the media in some ways has a hard time, I think, being clear about what the stakes are and about what the source of the conflicts are, rather than trying to tell it in this kind of horse race narrative of there's two sides and they're competing, as opposed to saying, this is the substance of the disagreement, and both of these positions are not, let's say, morally or equivalent, for example.
Right. Yeah. This two sides narrative, it's I don't know. You can't really ride two horses. That's my point. So,
That's a good one.
eventually you can for a little bit, but you're not going to write one correctly. And again, apart from that kind of joke, it's the fact that even if you limit yourself to just report in an objective way, you will probably see that it doesn't add up to put it on the same level. So that's up for leaving to the audience to think about it. Talking about the audience, I'd like to finish this with who did you envision as the audience for your book? Is it somebody more for one side or the other? Is it more of a academic text, or is for anybody interested in this? So who did you have in mind when you were writing this book?
So that's a great question. So I think, obviously, I'm hoping that my colleagues and students will read it. But I also think it's an accessible text, and I think it's talking about issues and questions that we all face in our daily lives and that we see on our TV screens and in our, in our politics. And so I hope that, folks will find it helpful for trying to think about this moment that we find ourselves in and thinking about, the challenges that U.S. democracy is facing. So I'm hoping that it will be of interest to folks who care about, being a good citizen and how to move forward in the United States.
And not only in the United States, it's about understanding. I'm going to close with what I usually say, that if we let the listener or the viewers in this case to leave this conversation with more questions and thinking a little bit more than when they started, I think we did a good job. I'm sure your book does exactly that. I will have links to your profile, to your website, to the book as well. Again, it's just called Black Grief, White Grievance, The Political of Loss. And I want to thank you for your time, and it sure made me think. And I think everybody should inform themselves before jumping to any conclusion. That's always a very good lesson, I think. So thank you again, Juliet.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Bye, everybody. Everybody stay tuned. Check the book, check the links, and subscribe for more stories that hopefully would make you think. Thank you very much.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Audio Signals with Marco Ciappelli. If you learned something new and this conversation made you think, then add this show to your favorite podcast player, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and share the ITSP Magazine Podcast Network with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to connect your brand to our conversations and our audience, visit itspmagazine.com to learn how to sponsor one or more of our shows. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey.